Hey there folks, Tim Slade here from the eLearning Designers Academy. Thank you so much for joining today's how-to workshop where we are looking at how to animate graphics in Articulate Storyline. Now, if you happen to be watching this on YouTube, make sure to click that like, subscribe, and that bell button so that you'll get alerted the next time I publish a video just like this one. Now, our how-to workshops are all focused on helping folks just like you improve their e-learning design and development skills so that you can be a better e-learning designer and create better e-learning content in the process. So today we're talking about animating graphics in Articulate Storyline. Now, before we jump into Storyline and learn about the timeline and how to create animated content, I want to take a few moments to talk about animation in the first place and the purpose that animation serves in our e-learning courses. And I'm going to jump over here to Storyline and let's take a look at a couple of slides that I've created here. You know, I want you to ask yourself, what is animation? Now, when I typically ask this question of folks, they'll usually say something like, well, it's movement on the screen, right? It's things moving around, right? And while that's technically true, I want you to really think about what the purpose of animation serves in our e-learning courses. You know, as I've been designing e-learning over the last almost 15 years or so now, when I think about animation, what I've realized is that animation is really about storytelling. Animation is used, when used properly, it's used to give meaning to what would otherwise be static content, right? And when you combine animations with audio narration, you can create moments of storytelling within your courses to help people understand your content a little bit better, or a lot better, at least the concepts that you're trying to explain, right? Now, whenever I talk about animation, there's always a couple of questions that come up that I'm not really focused on today. For example, people often ask, well, why shouldn't I be using these fun animations, right? When things bounce in or spin in or do weird things on the screen, why shouldn't you be using those? Well, you shouldn't be using them because they're distracting. Don't use them, right? Or this is another question. Oh gosh, that was an exciting slide transition. Should I put that in my next e-learning project? No, you shouldn't put this exciting, crazy slide transition in your next e-learning project. That's not really what we're talking about today. Or what about this one? You mean these animated bean people don't help my learners? Nope. These animated bean people from, I don't know, 1997's version of Microsoft PowerPoint, no, these do not help your e-learning courses. They don't help your learners. Just don't use them. They're awful. This is not what we're talking about today. Or you mean this text animation of fish like violently eating the text and swimming away? Is that not good for your e-learning? No, it's not. And in case you're wondering, this is a real animation from another e-learning program, Captivate, a text animation where there's fish that violently tear apart your text. I can't imagine an instance ever where this would make sense to use in an e-learning context, unless right now, with me criticizing it. My point is, don't use that particular animation. So what should you be using animations for in your e-learning? Well, the thing I always tell people is use animations to help your learners see what you're trying to say. That's really what animation is all about, helping your learners see what you're trying to say. It's taking concepts that would otherwise be hard to understand and helping your learners understand it by seeing it, right? That's what we're going to be focusing on today, helping you design animations that can better help you visually communicate your content. And we're also going to obviously look at all the technical features of how to animate content in Storyline. So let's go ahead and jump into Storyline. I'm going to close out of this preview here, and I have a bunch of different examples that I want to show you. Before we jump into some of the examples, I want to do a quick overview of the timeline for those who might be brand new to Storyline and aren't familiar with how Storyline works from the timeline standpoint. Now, Storyline is a slide-based e-learning authoring tool, right? Very similar to how PowerPoint is a slide-based presentation tool. And so just like you have slides in PowerPoint, you have slides in Storyline. But what makes Storyline really special, what goes above and beyond PowerPoint, is that Storyline is also a timeline-based e-learning authoring tool. Just like if you've ever worked with video editing tools like Camtasia or even something as simple as Windows Movie Maker, you have a timeline where you can control how things enter and exit off of your slide area. Now, the thing that makes Storyline different from tools like Camtasia or Windows Movie Maker or even other video editing tools like Vyond, which is a timeline-based tool as well, is that every slide in Storyline gets its own timeline. And so on each individual slide, it's like you can create your own little movies or animations on a slide-by-slide basis to again, help your learners see what you're trying to say. Now in Storyline, the timeline is down here underneath our slide. Sometimes it's collapsed, but you can always click on it and open it up here. And this is our timeline. And the timeline tells us a lot about what's happening on our slide and within our project. So first thing you'll notice here across the top is there's all these little numbers across the top. And those numbers represent durations of time. And we can see how long our slide is in duration by looking at where it says end here. Now, by default, every slide in Storyline, until you change it, by default, every slide is 5 seconds long. So we can see that here. This is where the timeline ends. Now, the timeline does a lot of other cool things for us. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to insert some random shapes onto our timeline. I'm going to insert a circle here, and I'm going to insert another shape. Let's do a triangle, and I'm just going to put those here, and then we'll insert another shape, and we will do a smiley face. It doesn't matter what these are. Oops, let me try that again. Shape, smiley face on our slide, right? And I'm gonna change the color of the triangle just so we can make sure there's some visual contrast, and I'll change the smiley face as well. Now, as I insert all of these items here on our slide, you will notice that if we look down here at our timeline, they're also represented on our timeline. And so the timeline gives us a visual representation of everything that's on our slide in Storyline. And so if I click on the smiley face, you can see that's highlighted here. If I click on the triangle, there's my triangle, and there's my oval or my circle. Now, the other cool thing about the timeline is that it shows what's known as the stacking order. And the stacking order is the order in which items are layered on top of each other in space, if you will. So if we look at my circle here, you'll notice that it's behind my triangle. And my triangle is behind my smiley face. And that stacking order, the way they're layered on top of one another, is also shown in my timeline. So if you come to my timeline, you can see the smiley face is up at the very, very top. And that means it's in front of everything else, whereas the triangle is in between those two items, and the oval is far in the back. Now, what's cool about this is I can actually change the stacking order in my timeline. So let's say I wanted my circle to be in front of everything else. I can just click and drag it to the top, right? And now it's sitting on top of everything else. Or I can right-click and send to back, and you'll see how it sends it to the back. It also sends it to the bottom of the timeline. Now, this is very similar to the selection pane in Articulate Storyline, or the selection pane in PowerPoint, excuse me. And I'll put a link somewhere where you can learn about the selection pane in a separate how-to workshop that I did on PowerPoint. But the timeline makes it really, really easy to see and visualize the stacking order and the timing of all of the objects on your slide. Now I'm going to go ahead and attempt to move the circle back over here. Okay, so we learned that the timeline is a visual representation of everything on our slide. We also learned that there's the stacking order. It's the way things are stacked on top of one another. Let's talk about some of the items over here to the left hand of our timeline. There's some important things that we're going to use here in a moment as we learn about animations in Storyline. So this first column here, this is the show hide checkboxes. And they look like little footballs, but they're actually little eyeballs. And these allow me to control the visibility of different items on my slide. So for example, if I wanted to hide the smiley face, I can click and hide it, hide the triangle, hide the oval, I can hide everything, right? And then I can click to show it all or hide it all just like that. Now, the reason that you would want the show hide icons or to use this feature, the reason why you'd want it is, let's say you have this circle back here and I need to edit it in some way, right? Rather than, and I don't know if anyone's ever done this before, if you were like me, before I understood the timeline, I would move things out of the way, make whatever edits I needed to make to my circle, let's say change the color, and then attempt to move things back to exactly where they were, right? Well, with the show hide icons, you can hide different items, make an edit, and then re-show items without having to actually move them, right? And I'll show you a practical use of that here in a moment. The next column we have here is our lock icon, our lock checkboxes. And the lock unlock checkboxes are essentially there to protect us from ourselves. So let's say there was something I didn't want to accidentally edit, delete, or move. Let's say the oval in the back, right? I can lock it. And now, no matter how hard I try, I can't click on this, I can't select it, I can't delete it, I can't move it, I can't edit it, I can't do anything with it because it's locked on my timeline. And this is very helpful when you're working with, say, slide titles that you don't want to accidentally move and other elements that you need to have fixed in place that you don't plan on editing. And it's very common when you're brand new to Storyline that you'll lock something and then forget that you locked it and you go, why can't I edit it? Well, always check your timeline because you go, oh, it's locked. And then you can unlock it and edit it, right? Same thing with things that are hidden, right? If you accidentally hide something and then forget to unhide it, and if you publish your course, you'll want to come back and make sure everything's unhidden because if it's hidden in your timeline, it will be hidden in the published course, all right? So those are the show hide checkboxes and the lock unlock checkboxes, and you'll see some uses of those here in a moment. Now this final area, this is where we can rename items in our timeline. And one of the things to know about Storyline is that it's super, super, super important that you give things meaningful names, especially when you're working with triggers or variables, which we're not talking about today. We'll talk a little bit about triggers when we talk about motion paths, but you can give things meaningful names. I call this my blue circle. I can call this my orange triangle, if I can type that. I'll call this my green happy face, right? I can give things meaningful names, and it makes it easier for me to work in Storyline. And it makes it easier for others that you might be collaborating with to work in Storyline. If you give things meaningful names, they'll know what you're referring to if you've named it in your timeline. Okay, so that's a basic overview of how the timeline is structured and how it represents different things on our slide. Let's start talking about how to animate with the timeline. So I'm going to go to this slide here, slide 2.2. And what we have here is we have a bunch of different items on our timeline. We have some audio narration, which is an item that gets put on the timeline so that we can sync animations with it. And you'll see the audio, because it's not really a visual item on our slide, you see it's represented here as a little icon on the lower left hand, just off of the slide area. But we have a bunch of other items. So if I click on this, you can see we have some learning objectives here. If I click here, we have a photo, I have another photo, and then there's a logo back here that I can't see right now, and then we have our slide title. Now this slide is a total of, if I go all the way down here, it's a total of about 25.5 seconds long. And the length of the timeline in this instance is dictated by the length of the audio narration. So when you insert something like audio or video, it's going to automatically extend the length of your timeline to accommodate the length of that piece of media, right? In this case being the audio narration, which is about 25.5 seconds. Now on this particular slide, I haven't done anything with animations. I haven't done anything with syncing the animations with the audio. I just have all of the elements on my slide. And what we're going to do is we're going to start syncing those and adding animations here in a moment. But before I do that, I want to make sure I have everything set up properly on my timeline. So you can see I've gone ahead and renamed many of these items. I have learning objects. I have my wellness. We'll call this my wellness photo. I can call this my happy people photo, my Health Co logo, which we can't see right now, and my slide title. Now in this particular instance, I'm not planning on doing anything with the slide title. I'm not animating it. I don't need to edit it. This is a great example where I might want to lock my slide title in place so that I don't accidentally move it or edit it in any particular way. And so now it's locked in place. I could do the same thing with the audio, but it's over here. I'm probably not going to mess around with it, so I can just leave it locked. Now, what I'm going to do real quickly is I'm going to play my timeline so that we can hear the audio and see what we have going on here before we start adding animations and syncing it. So one of the things we can do in the timeline is you'll notice there's these controls down here. There's a play and a stop button. And what that does is it controls this playhead. This is the blue playhead. And if I hit play here, it's going to take a few seconds to play, but it'll play the slide in the audio. We'll watch it here.
At Health Co, we believe that your wellness matters. Even if you're just starting to monitor your overall wellness, maintaining a balanced life can lead to a happier and healthier you. In this course, you will explore the importance of health and wellness, how to plan a healthy meal, and how to calculate your BMI. If you're ready to get started, click the next button to continue.
All right. So we have a slide there with some audio narration. It says here at Health Co, we believe in your health and wellness. it mentions some other really fluffy good stuff, and then it goes through our learning objectives. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how we can add animations to these objects, and then I'll show you how we can sync up those animations with our audio narration to create a fully animated slide, all right? So let's just start by adding some animations. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with our Health Co logo, which is right here on my timeline. I can't see it because it's sitting behind my photos and my learning objectives here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide the learning objectives. That's gone. I'm going to hide the photo, hide the other photo, and there's my Health Co logo. Now let's start adding some animations to this so that we can see what that looks like. So you can add any animations to any objects in Storyline by going to the Animations tab in the ribbon. And if you've ever worked with animations, say in PowerPoint, this is going to be probably familiar to you. Just like you can in PowerPoint, you can add entrance animations and exit animations. Storyline does not support emphasis animations, unfortunately, so we're limited to entrance and exit. And then we also have motion paths, and we'll talk about motion paths here in a little bit. Right now, we're just going to focus on adding entrance animations. Entrance animations, as the name suggests, is the type of animation that happens when something enters the slide, right? And right now it says none. That means there's nothing applied to it. But if I click on this, you can see I have all sorts of different animations I can apply. I can apply a fade, a grow, a shape animation, a spin animation, a swivel, bounce, zoom, and all sorts of other fun things. Now, I'll tell you, in the 10 years that I've been using and teaching Storyline and the hundreds of e-learning courses I've created in those years, I've probably only used 4 of these animations: fade, grow, fly in, float in, right? Because here's why. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. I talked about that earlier at the beginning of today's session, right? I'm not going to be using random bars or spin and grow. I might use zoom, but I'll tell you, I've never used swivel. I've never used the bounce in. I've never used the wheel, just because those are typically more distracting, all right? So in this case, let's say we want our Health Co logo to simply fade in, right? I'll just add a fade in entrance animation. Now, unlike PowerPoint, if we were working in PowerPoint, if I added that animation, it would preview it for me real quickly. It doesn't do that in Storyline, so I just have to trust that it's added a fade in animation right there. I can also control the duration of the animation. This means how long the animation takes. By default, it's 3/4 of a second, but I can make it go slower by increasing this or making it go faster, but 3/4 of a second tends to be just fine. And then I also have different animation options. I can control what direction it fades in from. If I don't select anything, it's just going to fade in from right where it's at, but I can make it fade in from the bottom, from the top, from the corner. But again, let's just keep it simple. We'll just have it fade in, all right? Now, if I just play this right now, I'm going to hit stop on my timeline to bring the playhead back to the beginning, and I'll hit play here. You'll see that's just going to fade in.
Here at Health Co, we believe that your
I'll stop it right there. That was really, really quick, right? Because it happened right at the beginning. So we've added an entrance animation to our Health Co logo. We'll come back to the exit animations here in a moment. Let's start doing our 2 photos. So I'm going to unhide those. So let's say with this photo here on the left, we want to apply another animation. I'm going to do, this time, I'm going to do a fly-in animation. Let's have it fly in. We'll leave it at 3/4 of a second, but we're going to have it fly in from the left, all right? So now I've just applied that animation. Now you'll notice that you get a little star icon when you have the Animations tab selected. These little star icons will show you, it'll show up next to items that you have animations applied. And that's a quick way to know whether or not an object has an animation applied to it. Now as for this photo here, let's say I want to apply the same animation that I just did. I could go manually do it, but one of the cool things you can do in Storyline is you can actually use the animation painter to copy and paste animations from one object to another. This is very similar to the format painter in PowerPoint and even the format painter in Storyline, where you can copy and paste formatting between objects. You can do the same thing with animations. So if I want to copy and paste the animation I just applied to this photo, I can go to my animation tab, and you'll see the animation painter here, and I'll click on it. And you'll see on my cursor I have a little paintbrush, and that means the animation painter is turned on. And I'll just click on this object, and now I have my little star icon, and I've copied and pasted that animation to it. And I can adjust it as well. So maybe I want this one to fly in instead of from the left. I'll have it fly in from the right, just like that. Now let's play this. I'm going to stop it again to bring my play back to the beginning. Let's play this. Again, all these animations will happen right away.
Here at Health Co, we believe that your wellness...
Everything's happening right at the start of the timeline. We'll change that here in a moment. Now let's also do our learning objectives here. So I have those selected here. That's this text box. In this case, maybe we want the animation for this to be, we'll have them float in, right? And we'll have them float in up from the bottom, all right? So I've gone ahead and applied animations to all of my objects in the timeline. And I've been mentioning up until this point that all the animations are happening right at the beginning. The reason why is because entrance animations take place right when the object enters the timeline. And in this instance, all of the objects are coming in right at the beginning of the timeline. So the next thing we're going to start talking about is how we can sync our animations so that they come in and out in sync with our audio narration. Now, in my opinion, there are two different ways you can sync animations. There's a manual way, and then there's an easy way. I'm going to start by showing you the manual way because I think it's important that if you're still learning how to create animated content, you should learn how to do it the hard way first, because trust me, then you'll really appreciate the easy way here in a moment. So what we want to have happen is we want to have all of these different items animate in time with our audio narration. So I'm going to show you the manual way. The manual way involves a lot of previewing of our slide and listening to our audio narration. So I'm going to hit play here, and I'm going to listen for when I want my HealthCo logo to animate in, all right? So I'll hit play here.
Here at HealthCo, we believe that your...
Okay, I'm going to pause right there. I know that was only like a second and a half, right? But right at the beginning, right at about 1 second, the audio narration says here at HealthCo, right? So maybe that's when I want the HealthCo logo to animate in. So I'm going to select my HealthCo logo in my timeline. We can't see it on the slide because it's sitting behind everything else, but that's okay. And I'm just going to drag it down to my playhead here at 1 second. That's where I paused it, right? And then I'm going to keep listening. So I'll hit play, and now I'm going to listen for when I want my two photos to animate in.
We believe that your wellness matters, even if you're just starting to monitor.
I'm going to pause it right there. So she says, here at HealthCo, we believe your wellness matters. Even if you're just getting started with, let's say, about 4.5 seconds. Let's say that's when I want the photos to come in. So I'm going to select this first photo, and I'll drag that down here in the timeline to about 4 seconds. And let's have the next one, this next photo, come in just maybe a half a second later. Maybe we'll do 5 seconds here, all right? Now let's listen for when the audio narration starts mentioning the learning objectives. So again, I'll hit play here and listen for that.
Just starting to monitor your overall wellness, maintaining a balanced life can lead to a happier and healthier you. In this course, you will...
Okay, I'm going to pause right there. So at about 12.5 seconds, she says in this course, leading up to all of the learning objectives that are mentioned. So now I'll take my learning objectives, and I'm going to drag these all the way down here to that about 12.5 seconds. All right, so now that I have timed out manually when I want everything to animate in, let's preview the whole thing to see how it looks. So I'll hit stop here. That will bring my playhead back to the beginning of my timeline, and I'm going to hit play here, and let's just watch it.
Here at HealthCo, we believe that your wellness matters. Even if you're just starting to monitor your overall wellness, maintaining a balanced life can lead to a happier and healthier you. In this course, you will explore the importance of health.
I'm going to stop it right there because there's obviously some things that have been left unfinished, right? We've timed out when everything's going to enter in on the screen, right? Our HealthCo logo, the two photos, our learning objectives, all that's great, right? The problem is now they're all layering on top of each other and it's hard to see everything, right? You can't even read those learning objectives. So the next thing we need to do is we need to adjust when things animate out and add exit animations, right? All we've been focusing on up until this point is changing when things animate in. So let's talk about when things animate out. Now, if I come to the end of my timeline here, all the way at the very end, you'll see, as I mentioned, the slide is 25.5 seconds long, and you'll see all of the objects in my timeline are all the way to the end. They stay on forever. And even if I were to adjust the length of my slide here, you see how they all stay attached here to the end of the timeline? Well, that's because they are actually attached to the end of the timeline. And I know that because there's these little arrows here. These little arrows at the end of each object tells me, it's an indicator that it's attached to the end of the timeline. And if I want those things to animate out at different points, I need to detach them from the timeline. Now, this is really easy. It takes a little mouse trickery and practice to get this down right, but once you've mastered it, it's pretty simple. So let's start with the Health Co logo. Let's say I want that to animate out after, a couple of seconds before those photos animate in. To detach that from the end of the timeline, I'm going to look for I'm going to hover my mouse over, or my cursor over the end of the timeline, and I'm looking for this double-headed white arrow. And this is the cursor that allows me to detach it. So I'll click and drag, and it detaches it from the end of the timeline. And I'm going to click and drag it all the way over here, and I'm going to have this animate out right when those photos start to animate in. Let's do the same thing with the photos, right? So the Health Co logo will animate in, then animates out, and then we have the two photos, and we need to have at least this photo here on the left animate out so we can see our learning objectives. So we're going to do the same thing with this Happy People photo here. Come to the end of my timeline, I'm looking for the double-headed white arrow, right? Just like that. Click and drag, and I'm going to align that here with my learning objectives, just like that. Now that will animate out or disappear right before my learning objectives animate in. But we're not going to stop there yet, because I also need to add exit animations. Right now, I don't have any exit animations applied, so it would just disappear abruptly, and I don't want that, right? So in this case, maybe we'll have this photo, we'll have it fade out. So I'm coming to my Animations tab. Here's my exit animations, and we'll have it fade out. And I'm just going to leave all the default settings, the duration at 3/4 of a second. I'll just leave the effect options as they are. And we'll do the same thing with the Health Co logo. I will have that fade out as well. All right. So let's go ahead and preview this again. I'm going to stop this to bring my playhead back to the beginning. Let's hit play, and let's watch this.
Here at Health Co, we believe that your wellness matters. Even if you're just starting to monitor your overall wellness, maintaining a balanced life can lead to a happier and healthier you. In this course, you will explore the importance of health and wellness, how to plan a healthy meal, and how to calculate your BMI. If you're ready to get started, click the next button to continue.
All right. So we did it. We animated that slide. We did it the manual way, and you see how long that took. It took quite a bit of time, and if we were working with a much longer slide, that could take a lot of time. Now I want to show you is how I can do the exact same thing, but I can do it much, much, much quicker using something called cue points. All right. So I'm going to go to slide 2.3 that I have here. It's an exact duplicate of the slide that I just animated. It has the same elements, the same audio narration, all of that good stuff. And I'm going to reanimate this, but I'm going to show you how quickly we can do it using cue points. But first, let me explain what cue points are. Cue points are simple little visual indicators that you can add to your timeline to let you know when you want something to happen. It's just like a little reminder. It's like a flag, okay? And if I click anywhere in my timeline, let's say here at 4 seconds, and I right-click, I can select this option to create cue point at playhead. And if I move my playhead here, you'll see it creates this little numbered cue point. And if I click here at 6 seconds, right-click, create cue point at playhead, I have another cue point, it's labeled number 2, and it'll keep adding those cue points in numerical order as I add them. And I can move these cue points around anywhere I want just a reminder that I want something to happen. Now, the cue points alone don't make it easier for me to animate this slide. If I wanted to add cue points when I wanted each animation to happen, the way I just showed you, I have to play, pause, add a cue point, play, pause, add a cue point, right, as I'm listening to the audio narration. But what's cool is that I can actually add cue points to my timeline as I'm previewing the timeline itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click and delete all my cue points. And I'm going to hit the stop button here to bring my play back to the beginning, and I'm going to preview this slide or this timeline. And as it's playing, I'm going to listen to it, and I'm going to hit the C key on my keyboard, C as in cue point, each time I want to add a cue point. And you'll see them add as I hit that C key. C as in cat, cue point, caret, you get the point. All right, so I'll hit play here. I'll take a moment, and I'll hit C key to add a cue point.
Here at Health Co, we believe that your wellness matters. Even if you're just starting to monitor your overall wellness, maintaining a balanced life can lead to a happier and healthier you. In this course, you will explore the importance of health and wellness, how to plan a healthy meal, and how to calculate your BMI. If you're ready to get started, click the next button to continue.
Okay, so I just added all of these cue points by hitting the C key as I was listening to the audio narration to be a visual indicator of when I wanted things to animate in and out. Now you'll notice that as she was reading the learning objectives, I added a few additional cue points, and I'll explain why here in a moment. But now that I've added my cue points, how can I sync up my animations? Well, I can click and drag these items just as I did before and align it to the cue point. But what's even cooler, a feature that's hidden in plain sight, is I can actually right click and align to cue point. And I'll align this one to cue point 1. Then the happy people will align to cue point 2. And I'll align this one to cue point 2 as well. And then my learning objectives I'll align to cue point 3. And now I've just synced up at least when each of those items are going to animate in. Now I still have to manually adjust when they're going to animate out, but that's no biggie. It just takes a few moments to do that. I come down to my Health Co logo, select that. I'll get my double-headed white arrow, detach it from the end of the timeline, and drag it all the way down here, and we'll have that animate out at 2 seconds. I liked how I had the photos staggered, so I'll just adjust that ever so slightly. And then for our happy people, I'll have that animate out right before my learning objectives come in. So I'll get my double-headed white arrow, click and drag, and now those will animate out at the 3rd cue point or when the learning objectives come in. And now I've synced it up, all right? Now let me add the animations too, because I didn't do that either. So for the logo, I'm going to add, we'll have it this time, we'll have it fade in, and then I'm going to have it fade out, all right? For the happy people photo, I'll have that one fly in from the left. And I'm going to have that one fade out. And then for my wellness photo, I'm going to have that one, it's taking a moment here to load. I'm going to have that one fly in from the right. And for my learning objectives, how about we have those float in? Give it a moment here. We'll have that float in. All right. So in just a few moments, using those cue points, I was able to listen to my timeline, preview it, use the C key to add the cue points to know where I wanted to animate them, each object. I was able to align each object to the cue point and add my animations, and it just took a few moments to sync up those animations. Now let's watch it and see if there's anything else we need to do. I'll hit the stop button here. Let's play it one more time and watch it.
Here at Health Co, we believe that your wellness matters. Even if you're just starting to monitor your overall wellness, maintaining a balanced life can lead to a happier and healthier you. In this course, you will explore the importance of health and wellness, how to plan a healthy meal, and how to calculate your BMI. If you're ready to get started, click the next button to continue.
All right. So that's fine. We did a really good job there, right? But it would be really nice if for these learning objectives, let me hide a couple of my pictures here so we can clearly see them. It would be really nice if my learning objectives, each bullet point animated in time with the audio narration as it's mentioned, right? Now, if you were like me, when I first got started in Storyline, the way that I would do that is I would put each bullet point literally in its own text box so that I could control when each one animates in on its own. And that's fine. It just means you have a lot of extra stuff on your timeline that you don't actually need to have. And so one of the cool things, a feature that's kind of hidden in plain sight, like a lot of other things in Storyline sometimes, is that you can actually control the animations of different paragraphs or bullet points individually. Let me show you how. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this text box here. And if I want to control when each bullet point animates in separately, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my Animations tab, and you'll see my effect options here, and I'm going to click on it. And you will notice at the bottom of my effect options dropdown, I have two options for sequence. Animate in as one object, or animate in by paragraph. Now by default, it's as one object. That means it's animating in that whole text box as a single object. However, I do have the option to animate by paragraph. Now what I want you to notice is when I select by paragraph, I want you to notice what happens here to the left of my show, hide, icon, or checkbox in the timeline. So I'm going to do by paragraph. And you'll see here, I get this little checkbox here, or this little caret. And what that allows me to do is it allows me to click and expand that object, which is my text box. And you can see now I have an individual item in my timeline for each bullet point in that text box. So it says, in this course, you'll explore the importance of health and wellness, how to plan a healthy meal, and how to calculate your BMI. So it's literally broken out each paragraph or bullet point into its own item. Now I can align these with my cue points. So I'll right-click, align to cue point. We'll align this one to cue point 4. I'll right-click on this one, align to cue point 5. Right-click on this, align to cue point, and cue point 6. Now I've controlled the animations for each of my bullet points. So let's hit stop. I'll bring this back to the beginning. Let's hide and show everything so I can see it all. And now let's preview it.
Here at HealthCo, we believe that your wellness matters. Even if you're just starting to monitor your overall wellness, maintaining a balanced life can lead to a happier and healthier you. In this course, you will explore the importance of health and wellness, how to plan a healthy meal, and how to calculate your BMI. If you're ready to get started, click the next button to continue.
All right. So we've just learned the basics of how to create animated content with the timeline, syncing it with your audio narration in Storyline. We learned what the timeline is. We learned how it represents the stacking order of objects in the timeline. We learned how to show and hide items in the timeline, how to lock, unlock, how to rename items. We learned how to add entrance and exit animations, how to sync them up, how to add cue points and align items to cue points, and how to animate by paragraph so that we can animate and control the timing of each bullet point one at a time. Those tips alone give you enough power to create all sorts of animated content in Storyline just using basic entrance and exit animations, all right? So I'm going to show you a slide from an actual client project that I worked on here, explaining the concept of double entry accounting, all right? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to undock my timeline so I can make it really, really big. So I'll click here to undock the timeline, which makes it large. The reason you'd want to undock the timeline is maybe you want to move it to a second monitor. But I want you to see how complex this timeline is. This is a complex set of animations. You can see how many objects I have going on here, and you can see where they all animate in and out. And there's nothing more complex here than entrance and exit animations. And this took me about 3 or 4 hours to animate for this client just to explain this simple concept of double entry accounting, all right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and preview this slide so you can see what it actually looks like. So let me redock the timeline. We may not be able to see the whole thing. I'll definitely try to scroll through it so you can see it, but I just want you to see how you can create really complex explainer video-like animations using simple entrance and exit animations in Storyline. So let's hit play and watch this slide. It's about a minute and a half long.
Let's take a look at a simple example to demonstrate how the accounting equation actually works and how this results in double entries in accounting. Let's say that the owner of your credit union invests $5,000 into your credit union. Since this $5,000 is equity that is owned to the owner, it is considered a liability under owner's equity. As it stands right now, the accounting equation is out of balance since we have $5,000 on the liability side. However, as we explored on the previous slide, for every transaction, there is an equal and opposite transaction for the other side. In this case, your credit union now has $5,000 in cash, which is an asset, so we'll show the $5,000 over here as well. Now the equation is equal. Let's take a look at another example. Let's say a member deposits $150 into their checking account. Since the credit union will eventually have to pay this money back to the member when they withdraw it, we have $150 listed as a liability. As before, the equation is now out of balance. To rebalance it, we'll add $150 to our cash account. Now, if we look at the left side of our equation, we have $5,150 in cash for assets. And on the right side, we have $5,150 in liabilities, which includes $150 in member accounts and $5,000 in owner's equity. The equation is now back in balance. Let's do one more example, this time a bit more complex. Let's say your credit union takes $1,000 from its cash to purchase a new computer, which in turn puts our equation out of balance. In this example, the new computer is considered an asset since the credit union owns it. So we'll list it here on the left side. Now we have a new account listed for office equipment and technology, listing the new computer as an asset for $1,000. In this situation, although the transaction took place entirely on the left side, the equation still balances. And that's the basics of how the accounting equation works.
All right. Obviously, that's more complex than what most people are going to be building, especially if you're new to Storyline, but it's a great example of how you can just use basic entrance and exit animations with some really good graphics and audio narration, of course, to create a really effective animated explanation of a concept, all right? So those are entrance and exit animations. Let's move on to motion paths, which is the third type of animation you can use in Storyline. I'm going to start by showing you the basics of how to add and edit and animate motion paths and time them to audio narration. But in this instance, we're going to keep it really, really simple. We're not going to focus on exit or entrance animations. We're just going to focus on motion paths, all right? So I have this really, really simple slide here. And let's say I want to use some motion paths to change how these different items animate in or move across the slide. So if I go to my Animations tab, we talked about entrance exit animations. The third type of animation we have is motion paths. And motion paths work very similarly to how they work in PowerPoint. The major difference, however, is how you adjust the timing for when the motion path is actually going to happen in Storyline. And I'll explain that here in a moment. Now, a motion path, unlike an entrance and exit animation, which takes place when an object enters and exits off of a screen, motion paths can happen at any time during an object's existence on the timeline. So let me repeat that. A motion path doesn't happen at the beginning or end. It can happen at any time during an object's existence on the timeline. So if we look at these icons, they exist for the entire duration of the slide. So the motion path can happen at the beginning, it can happen right at the end, or it can take place anytime in the middle, all right? So let me show you how to apply a motion path and edit the timing of it. It's actually quite simple. So I'm going to click on this broccoli icon, and to add a motion path, I'll click here to add a motion path, and there's a lot of different options, right? We have lines, arcs, turns. We can draw our own motion paths, which I'll show here in a moment. But let's just start with a simple line motion path. So I'll click here to add a line. And you'll see by default, it shows my object here, and then there's a line, and then there's a ghost image here for the icon. This shows where the actual object is going to move, and the blue line is the actual motion path, right? And I can change where I want it to go. Let's say I want, the object to go over here on the slide. That's where I can adjust where the motion path goes. Now, if we look up here in our ribbon here, you can see I can adjust the duration. Maybe I want it to go a little faster or slower. Let's say I want it to go take a second and a half to move. I can do that. I can also name the motion path. So we can call this we'll call it my green icon motion path. Very good. And then I can also select path options. So I can change the direction. And there's a bunch of other things here with easing, speed, and path, and I'll explore some of those here in a moment. Now, to control the timing of the motion path, you might not have noticed this, but when I created the motion path, Storyline automatically created a trigger in my triggers panel for the motion path. And this is how we control the timing of motion paths in Storyline. Now, for those of you who are new to Storyline, a trigger is simply a set of instructions that tells Storyline when we want something to happen, or what we want to have happen and when we want it to happen. So in this instance, I can see that this trigger says move the nutrition icon along the green icon motion path, that's how I renamed it, when the timeline starts on the nutrition icon. Now, this is why naming things in the timeline is so important, especially when you're working with triggers. Nutrition icon, it didn't make that up. I typed that in because that's what I renamed this item in the timeline. So it's moving that icon on the green icon motion path, which is what I called that motion path, on the timeline when the timeline starts. Now, if I preview this, I'll just hit stop here, and I'll preview the timeline. You'll see that it's going to move along the motion path right at the beginning. It can be difficult managing your... Okay, I'll stop that. It happened right at the start of the timeline because it said when the timeline starts on the nutrition icon. The timeline for the nutrition icon is starting right at the beginning, but I can adjust all of that. So let's say I wanted this motion path to move. I'm just going to make this up. Let's say we wanted it to move at 5 seconds, okay? To adjust that, I can do move the icon when timeline reaches, and I can insert a particular number. In this case, I'll insert 5 seconds, all right? Now let's preview it and see what happens. It can be difficult managing your health and wellness, especially with everything that goes into it. As soon as you stop to focus on one priority, you can see how it didn't move until it reached the 5-second point. Now, let me pause here. Let me save my project so I don't lose any of my work because I realize I haven't been saving here. So give me one moment. You should save early and often when you're working in Storyline. Okay, so we've added a motion path. We've adjusted the timing of it. Now let's do the same thing with the other couple of items we have here on the screen. Maybe for this icon, I want to add a motion path. We'll add a line. And maybe for this one, I want it to move more towards the center here, right about, I don't know, we'll say right there, all right? And for the timing of it, you'll see that it also added a trigger for it, so move the health icon along the motion path. Let's do this when timeline reaches 5 seconds as well. Okay. And I'll do the same thing with my blue running icon. I'll add a motion path, we'll do a line, and maybe I will move this one over on this side of the screen, right? I'm just making this up. We'll put it right there. Put it right about there. And it also added a trigger. We'll do when timeline reaches 5 seconds. Now you're probably wondering why the timing of motion paths are controlled with triggers, and I'll show you why here in a moment because it gets pretty cool. So let's preview this and see how this looks. So I'll hit play. It's probably not going to be perfect, but that's okay. It can be difficult managing your health and wellness, especially with everything that goes into it. As soon as you stop to focus on one priority, not too bad. All of the others are quickly forgotten. Those lined up pretty well. Maybe I need to adjust where this orange one goes. And now you might be wondering this. If you've ever worked with motion paths, how do you align the end points of it? It's always going to be a bit of a manual process. So I'm just going to move this one over ever so slightly, and let's see how that looks. So they're all lined up really well at the end. It can be difficult managing your health and wellness, especially with everything that goes into it. As soon as you stop to focus on one priority, pretty good. All of the others are quickly forgotten. Now, before I show you some of the other cool stuff you can do with motion paths, I want to mention something about timing motion paths. I showed you how you can adjust the timing by entering numbers here, so when timeline reaches, but you can also control the timing of motion paths with cue points. And we looked at cue points earlier, right? The little indicators you put on your timeline. So let's say I wanted to add a cue point at 5 seconds. I'll right-click, create cue point. And maybe at 5.5 seconds, I'll right-click and create cue point. And then at 6 seconds, I'll right-click and create cue point. So I've added 3 cue points. Cue points 1, 2, and 3, right? I can adjust when each of my icons move or when each of my motion paths are triggered based off of those cue points. So instead of when timeline reaches, I could do the nutrition icon when it reaches cue point number 1. And then I'll do when cue point number 2 here. And then when timeline reaches cue point number 3 right there. All right. Now let's see how that works. I'll hit stop here. Let's hit play. It can be difficult managing your health and wellness, especially with everything that goes into it. As soon as you stop to focus on one priority, all of the others are quick. So it happened in succession with each of those cue points. Now, the reason why you might want to associate motion paths with cue points is that you can easily adjust them with the cue points. So if I were to move, say, cue point 1 here to 4 seconds, and I'll move cue point 2 to 5 seconds, and then cue point 3 I'll leave at 6 seconds, it's automatically adjusting that in my triggers panel. I don't need to update my triggers for the timing. So I'll hit stop and hit play, and you'll see how it adjusted accordingly. It can be difficult managing your health and wellness, especially with everything that goes into it. As soon as you stop to focus on one priority, all of the others are quick. So you can see how that worked. So that's the basics of using and adding motion paths. Now I want to show you another slide from another client project that I worked on where I use a combination of entrance animations and motion paths to create an animated slide. And this is a great example of how you can use motion paths. So here's my timeline. I have a bunch of entrance animations and I have some motion paths taking place down here. I'll go ahead and preview this so you can see what it looks like.
There's a lot that goes into the operations of your credit union. Besides serving its members, in order for your credit union to successfully operate, it requires a team of accountants. They help to monitor financial performance and provide the information necessary for your credit union to make short and long-term financial decisions. In this course, you'll explore the role accountants play in your credit union, along with what they do and why they do it. You'll also explore how accounting information is used in the daily operations that make your credit union run smoothly.
All right. So you can kind of see how I use those entrance and exit animations and motion paths. So I'll preview this so I can kind of scrub through it and you can see it a little bit more in detail here. Give it a moment. I'll mute myself here, or mute the audio, and I'm gonna pause this. So what we have here is we have a fade in entrance animation, then this next set of graphics fades in, fade in animation, fade in animation, fade in animation, and then each of those objects, those graphics, had their own motion path that I staggered the timing of to create this kind of parallax effect, if you will, which I thought was kind of cool. And then we have our bullet points, animate in, and those are simply entrance animations. So that's a good example of how you can combine entrance animations and motion paths to create slides just like that, all right? Now let me show you one more cool thing you can do with motion paths. One of the cool things you can do, and this goes back to why you control motion paths with triggers, it's because you can actually make interactive motion paths. You can trigger a motion path based off of user interaction. So I've mocked up this really simple slide here where we want the learner to use these arrows here to try and land our UFO here on this little moon graphic here. And you can see I put a little hotspot for where I want them to move. So let's start by adding some motion paths to our UFO here, and then I'll show you how we can control it using these arrow buttons here that I've added. So I'm going to add a total of 4 motion paths to the single object, and that's another thing to know. You can actually add more than one motion path to an object, and this is an excellent example of doing this. So I'm going to add a motion path, and I'm going to add a line, and you're going to see it's going to go to the bottom here, and I might shorten it. I don't want it to move that far, so maybe I'll bring it up right about there. Oops, I did not mean to move the starting point. Let me move that back down. Okay, so there's my first motion path. It's going to move to the bottom. Now let's, while I have this motion path selected, there's a couple things that we need to check in our path options. So it's going to move to the down. The origin is unlocked. That means it's going to start here. Don't worry about that. Animation easing means it's going to ease in and out. We have the speed. And there's a few other options here, but the one I want to focus on is relative start point. So one of the cool things that we're going to do is that I can, once we make the motion path interactive, it can repeat itself, but I want it to repeat from where it ended, right? So you can see if I move the motion path here, if I repeat the motion path, I don't want it to go from here to here again. I want it to move from this point. So I'm going to select relative start point. It'll make sense in a moment, all right? So that was my first motion path for it to go down with a relative start point. That'll make sense in a moment. Let me add my next one. So I'm going to select my alien again, add motion path. We're going to, actually, let's do this too. Let's rename this motion path before I forget. We're going to rename this down. If I can select this, down. Again, renaming things is important. Let's add another motion path. This time we'll move it to the right. I'll add a line. Okay, let's do path options. We'll move to the right. I don't want it to move that far, so let me select my endpoint and let me move it over here ever so slightly, like that. That's pretty good. Again, give it a relative start point. So if it moves, again, it's going to move relative to that point. Okay, again, that'll make sense once we add the interactivity, all right? And then let's rename this one as well. Right, okay. Now let's add one to go up. So add a motion path, we'll go align. It's going to be, by default, it's going to go down, but we'll make it go up. So we'll do path options, we'll go up. And I'm going to also give it a relative start point. And let me click on my endpoint here. And I'm going to make that so it doesn't go so far. That's pretty good. And let's call this one up. Okay, and we'll do one more for it to go to the left. Okay, so click my alien, add a motion path, we'll do a line. We're going to set it to go to the left. I get my left and right mixed up all the time. We're going to do a relative start point, and I'm going to call this one, if I can select this text here, left, and I will adjust how far left it goes. So we'll put it right about there so it doesn't go too far. And that's pretty good. You know, I could spend a lot of time adjusting the length of it to make them all equal and perfect, but for now, that's just fine, all right? So I've added 4 motion paths to my object. And right now, you'll see it says move UFO along the down motion path. When timeline starts, move it right, move it up. I mean, it's going to move it in every direction. I don't even know what that'll look like yet. So let's preview that and see what that looks like. Because gosh only knows what direction it'll actually move in. Okay. So it just moved to the left for whatever reason. It's probably because it was the last trigger there, right? But we don't want it to move at the start of the timeline. What we want is we want it to move when the user clicks on one of our 4 buttons, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to move it down when user clicks, not on the UFO, but when they click on the down arrow, okay? Then we're going to move the UFO to the right when user clicks on the right arrow. And then we're going to move the UFO up when the user clicks on the up arrow. Where is that? There's my up arrow. And then we will move the UFO to the, did I do the left? Yes. When user clicks on the left arrow. And I think I have all of them, right? So we have down to the down arrow, left to the left arrow, right to the right arrow, up to the up arrow, okay? So I've just made those motion paths interactive. And because they have a relative start point, I'll show you how this works. So let me preview the slide. Okay, now they're not moving, right? But if I click here to the right, it moves it to the right. Now the relative start point, the reason I did relative start point is because if I didn't do that, if I clicked to move it to the right, it would start from the start point again and go to the right. But now because it's relative, it's just going to keep going to the right, just like that. I can make it go up. I can make it go to the left. I can make it go down. And now I have a little UFO that I can control, right? Now, what if I want to land it here on the moon, right? That's kind of the challenge. Land the alien on the moon. Now, let's close out of here. You'll notice that I put a little hotspot here. What's cool is that you can make objects interact with one another. This technically has nothing to do with animations per se, but I want to show this nonetheless. So what happens, what do we want to have happen if the alien actually lands on the moon, hits this hotspot, right? Well, maybe we want to show this slide layer. You did it, right? You landed the alien on the moon. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a trigger that tells storyline, show layer, our success layer, when object intersects. So when 2 objects intersect with one another, when object intersects, what object? We're going to do our alien UFO thing here. When it intersects with our hotspot, which is our landing spot here, okay? So show layer, the success layer, when the object intersects with the landing spot. I'll click OK. Now let's see if that works. We're going to land this alien on the moon. Okay. We're going to go to the left here. Keep going to the left. Let's go down a little bit. Keep going. I think I'll go one more. It's about lined up. Okay. Oh, and it intersected and I landed him on the moon. And now we have our success layer, all right? So that's how you can create interactive motion paths in Storyline, which is super, super cool, right? You may not ever create a course on landing an alien on the moon, but maybe you'll find some sort of creative way to apply that to your courses, all right? So that's how you use a lot of different animations in Storyline. I want to show a couple of examples as we close up here about how I've used animations to help my learners see what it is I'm trying to say, how to visually communicate my content. So I'm going to preview this scene here where I've added some examples here. Preview the scene. And I'm going to show you several examples from my career where I've used animations, and I'll tell you a little bit about them. This first example I'm going to show you was a course on inventory shortage. And the purpose of the course, and this was the original slide, and the original content that was provided to the learners. And the purpose of this particular course in this slide was to help retail employees understand that when shoplifters steal merchandise, it creates an inventory shortage, right? And this was the original content. It was a bunch of bullet points. It wasn't really that effective. And so what I decided to do instead was use some simple entrance and exit animations to visualize the concept. So I turned these bullet points into a narrative and then added animations to explain it. So let's go ahead and watch it here.
It goes without saying that all of the merchandise in our store has value. The value represents the retail dollar amount at which the company owns the merchandise. For example, this t-shirt has a ticketed retail price of $30, so the company owns this shirt at $30. If a store has 10 of these t-shirts, then the company owns these shirts for a total of $300. This same concept applies to clearance merchandise as well. Whatever the retail price is of the merchandise, that's the price the company owns it at. So how does this apply to inventory shortage? Going back to our t-shirt example, if our inventory system states that a store should have 10 t-shirts at $30 a piece, but we find that 3 of them are missing, we have an inventory shortage of $90. This information is used to calculate an...
I'll pause that right there. So that's a great example of using entrance and exit animations to explain what would otherwise be a complex concept. I'll show you another example from this course. Again, this was the original slide, and the purpose of this slide was to help retail employees, when a store is going through inventory, understand how inventory tags should be placed throughout a department. And so this was the original content with 3 simple bullet points. Inventory tags should be placed in numerical order. They have to be placed on fixtures from front to back, left to right, with department walls tagged last. The concept seems simple, right? But what we found is that employees really struggled when they were actually on the sales floor figuring out how to do this, given that each store is a little bit different. So what we decided to do is we decided to animate it and explain it visually so somebody could actually see it. So let me show you the example here.
Area tickets should be placed in numerical order from front to back and left to right, snaking through the department. For example, in this department of the store, area ticket placement would start here and continue through the department until reaching the end. The wall should be tagged either before or after the department fixtures. Just be sure to be consistent from one department to another. In this example, the wall is tagged after the department fixtures.
All right, I'll pause that there. So again, by just changing how we presented the information, doing it with a series of animations, actually better prepared learners, in this case retail employees, to go perform this behavior actually on the sales floor. And while I don't have the example of it here, that also allowed us to turn this into an interactive scenario where we created a simple drag and drop where they practiced doing this in an e-learning course with several different department examples, again, preparing them for what they actually had to do on the job. So those are just some examples of how you can use animations in your e-learning and how you can work with the timeline and storyline. I'm going to close out with some of my top tips for using animation in e-learning. These are my 3 tips if you're going to use animations in your next e-learning project, specifically if you happen to be doing it in storyline, which is what I showed you here today. First, tip number 1, use animations to help your learners see what you're trying to say. The purpose of animations is to give meaning to what would otherwise be static content. So use it to help elevate your story, elevate your message so that they can literally see, quite literally, what you're trying to say. Tip number 2, use animations consistently and with intention. If you can't explain why you're using the animation, then you probably shouldn't be using it at all. And you want to make sure you're being consistent with the style of your animation. So if you're using fade-ins, use fade-ins. If you're using float-ins or zoom-ins, then use them consistently. When you change up animations, your learners are going to wonder or think that there's some intention behind it. So be intentional, be consistent. This is my final tip, my favorite tip. When in doubt, fade in and out. Like I said earlier, just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? So when in doubt, just fade in and out. You can never go wrong with that, all right? So I want to thank you so much for watching today's how-to workshop. Like I said at the top of today's video, if you happen to be watching this on YouTube, make sure to hit that like, subscribe, and that bell button so you'll get alerted the next time I publish a how-to video just like this one or any other video on the YouTube channel. And of course, check out the links down in the description where you can sign up for all of my future live events. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'll see you around. Bye.